Hi, and welcome back to the News Now, a podcast exploring the findings of the Digital News Report Australia 2024. And I'm your host, Caroline Fisher. In this third episode, I'm talking with Tim Duggan, the chair of the Digital Publishers Alliance, about generational shifts in news consumption. Hey, Tim, how are you? Thanks for taking this Zoom call. And where are you exactly?
Hello, Caroline. Lovely to speak to you. I'm currently coming to you from Mallorca, which is the beautiful Spanish island in the Mediterranean where I split my time between here and Australia.
Okay, well, I can hear the audience's eyes roll, thinking, wow. Okay, technology. See, there are many good sides to technology. Look, before we get into the report, can you just tell us a bit about the Digital Publishers Alliance and how it came about?
Yeah, the Digital Publishers Alliance is a non-profit industry body that was established a few years ago because there wasn't really an industry body that represented this long tail of independent publishers in the country. I know that well. I co-founded a independent media company called Junkie Media, which was a publisher for Australian millennials, or just young people, we called them before we even started calling them millennials. And my business partners and I built that up into about 60 full-time staff before we sold it in 2016. Then I left the business in 2020. And before I left, I started an email chain with some of my other contemporaries, people who had built media businesses around the same time as me. And we just used the email chain to complain about Facebook algorithms. Is anyone noticing this happening on Google search? Just all of these things. And once I had left full-time work at Junkie Media, I noticed this email chain just kept on continuing. Every time something important bubbled up, it continued going. So I realized that we actually needed an industry body, and if no one else was going to do it, I would start it. So the Digital Publishers Alliance now has about 60 members, and we are all independent publishers, all ranging from 3 full-time staff up to 100. And we essentially are the long tail of Australian news and Australian journalism. And it is really amazing to have a group that comes together to connect with each other, to support each other, and to protect our industry. And that's what the DPA is.
Oh, that's great. Thanks. And there's obviously a lot of challenges facing you. We're going to speak about some of those in a little while. So your experience with Junkie makes you the perfect commentator on generational shifts in news consumption. In this year's report, you wrote a really interesting commentary called Gen Z is having their news moment. What did you mean by that?
It's fascinating looking at different generations' approach to news. And I originally, when I was running Junkie Media, that was for millennials. I consider myself the world's oldest living millennial. And we were dealing with, at the time, what were young people and are now everyone up into their 40s. And we rode a wave at Junkie Media of millennials at the time becoming really interested in news. And there generally needs to be a moment that pulls young people in. Because if you think about it, go back to Gen Z, or when you were the age that a Gen Z is now, which is roughly 12, 13 to 25, 26. There's a lot going on in your life. There's a lot of things to distract you. It is a very pivotal moment in life. And news and consumption of news generally is not something that you pay that much attention to unless you're a journalism student or you're studying it or your parents are into it, unless there's a particular topic or two that pulls you into it. And for my generation, particularly in Australia, there was a real sense of engagement around the time that Tony Abbott got elected as Prime Minister.
Fancy that being a source of interest to people.
Yeah, it was really interesting. We just launched Junkie in 2013, and I think Tony Abbott got elected at the end of 2013. And for a lot of our audience, there was this real disconnect at the time between what they thought, who was representing them, and the values that they believed they had. And we rode that wave, and we really doubled down on hiring news reporters and journalists to go deep into that. And then once we had young people hooked into news and engaged, we then could expand it out into other topics. And it feels at the moment, and what some of the data that we've seen in this report is that for Gen Z, there's always a news moment for most generations. And the Israel-Palestinian conflict at the moment seems to be a a way in for young people who feel really strongly about certain parts of this conflict to be drawn into news and to start paying attention and to start following news sources. And that is reflected in some of this data where we've seen that a steep rise in news consumption amongst Gen Z, with 44% of them now classified as heavy news consumers, which is up 8% year on year, which is a really large, statistically significant number.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely true. You said that this gives you hope. Why?
I believe we all need to be engaged with the news. The more of us that are engaged with the news, with the world around us, with what's going on, with atrocities, with injustices, with hope, with fear, we all need to be engaged with the news. And if you go back a few years ago, Gen Z weren't that engaged. And there is a fear, mainly due to how they consume their news, which we can talk about later. But there is a fear that if you are not engaged with the news, then there is no accountability for society. There is no real democracy if people are tuned out and are too busy scrolling on TikTok to care about what politicians are doing behind their back. So I think any democracy that is highly engaged with news is a better democracy.
Indeed. Okay, so yeah, that's true. We have seen this increase in heavy news consumption among Gen Z, and increasingly they're going to social. On the one hand, it looks like that's, good growth and you feel positive about that, but are there risks? Is there a downside to them shifting to social?
There's huge risks in getting your news solely from social media. And the biggest risk is that social media is a rented platform that news publishers create news on. And that is all good and well when that rented platform decides that they're going to show that news to your consumers. But the biggest risk and the biggest danger is if the digital platforms that deliver this news, and for this, we're talking about Meta, so Facebook, WhatsApp, Instagram, we're talking about TikTok, we're talking about Google, even Twitter or X. All of these are platforms inherently run by large multinational companies based outside of Australia, whose, generally speaking, sole reason for existing is profit and growth. And at certain times, these digital platforms can decide that a good way of getting profit and growth is delivering news to people. And that is something that Meta, for example, with Facebook, decided many years ago. When I was running Junkie Media, we were courted by Meta in order to create content, hire journalists, post video news. One stage, we had a daily video news show funded completely by Facebook with 3 or 4 journalists on it for a couple of years. And that was because for them, that was their way of delivering information. And then all of a sudden, the digital platforms can decide to deprioritize news in their feeds. And that is a huge risk for news consumers, for society, for democracy. And we're seeing that at the moment with Meta and the games they're playing with the Australian government and with the Australian people over their decision to stop funding news after many years of doing that. So it gives me hope that young people are engaged in news, but it gives me a lot of room for concern that they're engaged in news through social media.
Where will they go, do you think? I'm sure you're discussing this amongst your colleagues in the alliance.
Yeah, it is the $1 million question. And all of the signs that we're seeing is that, yes, young people are engaged through news through social media, but if they didn't receive it through social media, most of them wouldn't consume news at all. And that data comes from one of our DPA members, the Daily Oz, who have over 500,000 Instagram followers. And they asked their audience questions about how they got their news, and 25,000 people responded. And many of them said that they wouldn't access news on social media if it didn't come to them through Instagram. They would just go back to being unaware of all of this stuff going on. And I don't blame them. I think as a society, we train humans to find and consume content in particular ways. And the algorithms and the publishers themselves. We have trained audiences, young audiences in particular, to wait for news to come to them through their algorithm on social media.
Mm.
And therefore, when that cuts off, it's extremely alarming, and it could have a huge impact on Australian democracy. And that's something that at the Digital Publishers Alliance, we are fighting tooth and nail to make sure that government is aware, to make sure the public is aware. And that is a real giant orange flashing light going on at the moment in the news industry.
Fascinating. That's right. So it's about re-educating them to actually look for news instead of just, always bumping into it and always having it just sort of pouring towards them. Yeah, it's really interesting. In the second episode of the podcast, we talked about audience attitudes to news produced by AI. And it found that most people are comfortable with news that's mainly produced by humans with a little bit of AI assistance, but we're not that comfortable about news that's mainly being produced by AI with just a bit of support from a human. The role of AI, it's presenting huge challenges for news publishers at the moment. What do you see as the risks here for these digital news publishers?
AI is the biggest opportunity for news publishers and the biggest threat. And both of those things are just two sides of the same coin. And you can't talk about one without talking about the other. So to start talking about opportunity first,
Okay.
there is real amazing current use cases on how AI can help journalists create better content, faster content, more content, all the things that we want. And most newsrooms are using AI in some way at the moment.
Yeah.
And that is a wonderful thing. So there's real positives to it. But the threat is probably bigger than those opportunities at the moment. And the threat, actually maybe want to change even the terminology around a threat, because a threat implies something that is yet to happen. Whereas what's happened with AI, it's already happened. So the content of every professional news publisher in the world has already been scraped by AI companies and is already being regurgitated back to consumers, often with a price point put on top of it that completely cuts out the news publishers doing that, to the benefit of the AI companies. And that is so unsustainable. I think anyone can look at that and say, so the person paying the content and having journalists create the content is doing that. And in the past, the contract for that is that Google or anyone else would send people towards your site. And now that is just been completely cut off. That content has been stolen. It's been repurposed and repackaged, and not just stolen from one publisher. It has been stolen from thousands of publishers in order to get around existing copyright laws, and then regurgitated back to people, and without giving them a need to go back to a news publisher's website. So the entire model just falls over if this continues. And that is a world that is not too far off. And that is something that we are trying to do everything we can to stop.
So, okay, what do you do though? I mean, like you say, has the horse bolted?
The horse has bolted. However, I am filled with some confidence that the governments, and particularly the Australian government, does allow us to help design the field. And by this, I mean AI has moved quicker than any of us could ever have imagined. And therefore, legally and morally and ethically, we as a society haven't caught up yet to where they're at. And Caroline, you and I both know government. It is a relatively slow-moving beast. But I do have faith, based on discussions we've had with all range of ministers and attorney general, from legal ramifications through to moral, through to ethical, through to government frameworks, that governments do have the ability to be able to rein it back in. And I think that's sadly probably our only avenue here, which is direct government intervention into that. We also do have things like negotiations going on with AI companies.
Yeah, there are some people who've successfully cut deals.
They have, and there's a lot of opinions on whether those deals are ultimately positive for journalism or negative for society. And whilst there is some positives in getting paid for content, and that is the way that the internet has always worked, publishers produce great content and people pay for it. There is the other side of that, which is publishers just become content farms to train algorithms for as long as the deal lasts, and then the algorithm gets smarter than them and doesn't need them anymore. However, overall, I personally think that doing deals with some of these big AI companies is actually quite beneficial at this stage, because it does allow for payment of the content to go back to the people who create it. But as I said, there's a whole different can of worms.
Cans of worms. It just feels like the news industry, you get your head above water on one thing, there's intervention, there's regulation, so with the News Media Bargaining Code, for instance, and now we're being hit by another wave. You barely have time to take a breath and to get your head above water.
It really is like that. I think it's a really fascinating time to be in news. I think it's always an interesting time to be in news and in publishing, but right now is one of the most fascinating times. And I am an optimist. It kind of underpins almost everything that I do. So I tend to view things in a relatively optimistic light, which is our society will always need news, and consumers will demand news. And the ways that they get them and the avenues that they appear to them will constantly shift. And in 50 years' time, if we have a podcast again, it will look very different to how we are discussing things now. And I think if you believe that news is important in our society, which I do, and I know you do, Caroline, then it will always find a way through.
And we'll keep tracking the changes and the way the audience responds as we keep doing this survey every year and continue to track the news consumption trends and attitudes in Australia to all these constant changes. Good to end on a positive note. Thank you, Tim, and thank you so much for your time. Thanks everyone for listening. If you want to find out more about the news now, please tune in to our 4th episode about paying for news. Catch you then, and bye for now. This podcast was proudly produced by the University of Canberra on Ngunnawal and Ngambri country. A big thanks to Rach White for her production, the Digital News Report Australia team, all of our interviewees, and Dilika Patharatna for organising it all. If you want to find out more about the Digital News Report Australia, please go to the link in the show notes. This podcast series, The News Now, by the News and Media Research Centre and UCFM. We hope you enjoy listening.